Thank you for coming to our symposium presented by SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative here at NYU, and CENTRO, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. So today's symposium, in the wake of empires, sorry, I forgot the title for a second, Critical Reflections of 1898 and its Afterlives, has it's been a long time coming, and I'm sure folks at SULO and CENTRO have heard me talking about this for the last 3 years. So, you don't have to hear from me again. Maybe I'll see you at the 150th anniversary. I'll hit you up. So before starting, I just want to acknowledge some of our co-sponsors for this event. That includes, of course, the KJCC, which is the space that we're in today, and I thank Jordana Mendelson for her help and support and behind the scenes. Also, the Hemispheric Institute, the Center for the Humanities at NYU, the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, the New York Southeast Asia Network, the Asia Pacific American Institute at NYU, and the Latinx Project at NYU, and also the Asian American Asian Research Institute at the City University of New York. I also just want to give a few shout outs and acknowledgements to some of my colleagues with whom I've been talking to kind of intellectually think this through. And that includes Nerissa Balse, who can't be here today, Sony Coranias Bolton, who was scheduled to be one of our panelists, but unfortunately won't be able to make it today. But we wish him well, and he's here in spirit. And also Ileana Rodriguez Silva, who's always been support morally, intellectually, and etc. And just a quick thank you to both SULO and Centro's support and trust for putting this symposium together. Especially Centro's previous director, Yarimar Bonilla, as well as our current director, Jomaira Figueroa. Also to Angel Antonio and Cristel Jusino Diaz, who is our director of research programs and public humanities, whom you'll see a little bit later today in our program. And of course, a quick shout out to all of the staff working the event, to Kim Roas and Dio Scauri, who are in the front, who registered you in. Jorge Soldevila, who is who's moderating the Zoom and who's behind the scenes, as well as Manuel and Eli, who are recording this event. So let's start. So 1898 to 2023. 125 years since the year in which the idea of US manifest destiny would took on a new life. No longer content with having closed the continental frontier, and the violent incorporation of lands and peoples from sea to shining sea, as it were, the US would turn its imperial eyes beyond the continent's terrestrial edges and oceanic borders toward other seas, islands, archipelagos, and peoples in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So as this symposium reflects upon the historical events of 1898, their immediate consequences, and their prolonged afterlives that continue on well into the present, it owes a debt of intellectual gratitude to the cadre of scholars and cultural workers that have and continue to draw critical and scholarly attention to histories and cultures of Spanish and US empire, especially since around the centennial of 1898, provoking us to problematize national histories and civic myths, question romantic narratives of revolution, shed light on the anarchic character of empire, and draw attention to forgotten and or silenced insurgent histories. So the work of poet, scholar, and NYU professor Luis Francia his work belongs to this body of scholarship, in particular the conference that took place here at NYU, which led to the landmark publication Vestiges of War, the Philippine-American War, and the Afterlife of an Imperial Dream, 1899 to 1999, which was a tome of essays and creative works produced by writers, scholars, and artists from the Philippines and its diaspora. For indeed, if 1898 was poorly remembered within at least the American social imaginary, the Philippine-American War that broke out precisely as a direct result of it was altogether forgotten. So sharing in Luis Francia's aspiration for that book to provide, quote, a fuller understanding of why precisely America came to figure so prominently in the lives of Filipinos, in their waking hours, their dreams, and nightmares. So this symposium builds upon that aspiration to consider how the US, as well as Spain, have and continue to figure in unexpected ways across the histories, experiences, and cultures of those in the Philippines, as much as in Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and their respective diasporas. So while our panels and panelists reflect upon empire, its legacies, as well as its ongoing realities in all of its variant manifestations, particular to each space and diaspora, all of which are diverse in their own right, our hope is that the symposium serves as an opportunity for our invited scholars and experts in the histories and cultures of each to engage each other in productive dialogue and identify some of the overlapping and interconnected experiences and intertwined and overlapping histories, to use the words of Edward Said, that empires have and continue to leave in their wake across the globe. As such, the goal is not to lose sight of the particularities of diverse histories, experiences, or cultures, but rather highlight them toward the goal of learning from each other, how others have or continue to resist, navigate, or perhaps simply live under the shadow of empire. Through discussions between our expert panelists, as well as with our audience members here in the auditorium, as well as on Zoom, we hope that this becomes a space to think collectively and relationally, not only about the significances of 1898 to us today, but also equally important to imagine anti-colonial and decolonial possibilities and futures for us in the present. And with that, I leave the floor with some opening remarks from Luis Francia on behalf of SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Magandang umaga, buenos dias. Welcome. I'm Luis Francia, adjunct professor with the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and co-chair of NYU SULO, the Philippine Studies Initiative. The chair is Professor John Gershman of the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and Emily Tumale, PhD candidate, is our project manager. SULO is happy to be one of the co-sponsors of this symposium that would not have been possible without the dedication, energy, and vision of Matthew Arnold Nicdao. SULO was started in 2020, just before the pandemic, with seed money from Senator Lauren Legarda, a Philippine legislator, who also provided funding for other Philippine studies programs in London, Madrid, and Berlin. The idea being was to promote Philippine studies programs because there were, if any, very few abroad. Drawing from schools across NYU, SULO aims to promote an exploration of the Philippines that cuts across disciplinary boundaries. We are interested in the entire spectrum of knowledge, including the sciences, cultural and artistic production, and historical and contemporary social issues. SULO has connections with such NYU departments as the Asian Pacific American Institute, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the King Juan Carlos of Spain Center, enabling programs and cross-disciplinary initiatives that attend to the relationship of the Philippines with Asia, Latin America, and Spain, and not just the United States. In a way that engages the Filipino diaspora here and elsewhere, SULO has sponsored or co-sponsored a wide variety of events and programs over the past 3 years, including webinars on caregivers and their situation during the pandemic, speakers such as Vicente Rafael and Walden Bello on Philippine politics and authoritarianism, a 2021 virtual production of a play, and a virtual conference on Magellan's tragic landfall in the Philippines, a talk by Vice President Leni Robredo on her vision for the Philippines, and a virtual conversation with filmmaker and Philippine national artist Kidlat Tahimik. An ongoing program of SULO is Panawin, a series of films made both in the Philippines and in the diaspora, curated by eminent film historian Hil Quito. In fact, the films are screened right here at KJCC, with the next offering slated 2 days from now, on Friday. Those of you who are still in town, please come and see these films, and it's all for free. Thank you. Here's to a productive and enjoyable symposium. Maraming salamat. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jomaida Figueroa Vasquez, and I'm the director for the Center for Puerto Rican Studies here at CUNY Hunter. I'd like to welcome you all to this special one-day symposium, In the Wake of Empire, Critical Reflections on 1898 and its Afterlife. I'd like to take a moment to thank Matthew Nicdao, CENTRO Research Associate, for conceptualizing and organizing this event. I'd also like to thank SULO, the Philippine Students Initiative at NYU, for co-organizing this event with us, as well as the King Juan Carlos for the First of Spain Center at NYU for hosting the event, and the Mellon Diaspora Solidarities Lab for supporting one of our panels, as well as all of our partners. I would like to thank my Centro staff and events team for their tireless work and vision. As our organizers noted, one of the project's main goals is to trace our shared and overlapping experiences under Spanish and US empires, as well as to highlight the connections and parallels between distinct spaces and peoples that constitute this global constellation of islands. To that end, the symposium will engage 3 themes that bring together the histories of Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines. The first is the overlooked histories and new approaches to the world of 1898. The second is living with and under US empire in the 20th century. And the third is imperial afterlives and decolonial futures. I really wish I could be there with you today, but I want to thank you once again for joining us in this exciting and historic event.
Let's get started. Thank you, Luis and Jomaida. We also wish she was here. Unfortunately, she can't. So our first panel. So just a quick overview of the panel format. So we'll begin with. I'll start with introductions for each of the panelists, and then each of them will make their way up to the podium to give short presentations. And then shortly after the presentations, we will start our discussion. And so we'll have all of our panelists move over to our living room. And then we'll move over to Q&A. So that said, let me introduce our first panel, Overlooked Histories and New Approaches to the Worlds of 1898. So I'll read the introductions in order of their presentations. So today we'll be starting with David Sartorius is Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland and the author of Ever Faithful, Race, Loyalty, and the Ends of Empire in Spanish Cuba. His research on Cuban history has included work on the history of slavery and abolition, race and anthropology, and migration and mobility. He is the co-editor of Social Text and an organizer of the annual Tepoztlan Institute for the Transnational History of the Americas. The title of his presentation today is How to Leave Cuba, Imperial Pasts and Passports. So after Professor Sartorius, we'll move on to Professor Kristen Oberiano, who is an assistant professor of history at Wesleyan University. Kristen's research examines the 20th century evolution of the political, social, and cultural relations between indigenous Chamorro people and Filipinos under the United States Empire in Guam. Kristen is a third-generation Filipino born and raised on Guam and currently serves as a board member of Guahan Sustainable Culture, a nonprofit organization dedicated to food sovereignty in Guam. And following Kristen, we have Professor Jose Fuste, who's Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Born and raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico, his interdisciplinary research unravels the uses and abuses of, quote, practical pasts, end quote, and pastness, that is, through historiography, archival practices, and public memory, about Latinx Antillians in the US and their migrations. He's currently writing a book titled Entangled Crossings, Afro-Latinx Migrations Between Race and Empire, which reveals some of the transnational and transcolonial intersections, relationalities, and interruptions of turn-of-the-century Afro-Hispanophone Antillians who lived between New York, Florida, and the Caribbean between the 1870s and the 1920s. He also recently authored a chapter for the forthcoming Cambridge History of the Cambridge History of the Caribbean on anti-Black and particularly anti-Francophone or Anglophone Afro-Antillian 19th century thought and politics, and the impact it had on the rise and fall of Hispanophone Antillanista confederalisms at the turn of the 20th century. His presentation titled today is called Unsettling 1898, Unwritten Ledgers and Multi-Layered Debts Across Entangled Geographies and Temporalities of Empire. And sorry, I forgot to mention Professor Kristen Oberiano's presentation title is Colonial Siblings, Filipino Revolutionary Exiles, and the Chamorro Elite and Imperial Transitions. So thank you. I leave the floor to you, David.
I'm so thankful to be here. I thank you, Matthew. I thank every one of the organizers. I'm so thrilled to be in a interdisciplinary space and one that's about crossing our various regional divides, which kind of echoes what I want to talk about today, which is about border crossing and mobility. This event, going first, I set another context. This event is as much a reflection on 1998, like that. Yeah. This is a reflection on 1998 as much as it is a reflection on 1898. As a precociously young graduate student, I took part in centennial events in Cuba and the United States. If you're trying to do the math in your head, I was 10 years old in 1998. This is a time of it's a relatively new expansion of travel and research access for both Cuban and US scholars. So these events included, say, an ACLS initiative that paired 4 Cuban and 4 North American scholars to go to the US National Archives and Library of Congress for 2 weeks. There was a conference at a regional provincial archive in Cuba. There were these dialogues with like historians of US foreign relations who were very humbly listening to area studies perspectives. And the agenda that emerged from those events in 1998 seemed relatively clear to me. And the first was about moving beyond national analytical frames, because it kind of inhibited the ability to connect 1898 to what was happening in Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the United States, to the big isms: capitalism, imperialism, and even and especially nationalism. And of course, not all national frames are weighted equally. And it seemed like scholars of the US and US foreign relations had the most work to do. And the second the kind of priority coming out of those conversations was the idea of transnational scholarly dialogue, that academic agendas should be defined and carried out with scholars from across regional divides, and doing the work of supporting each other, even when political relations are not amenable to that. 25 years later, I kind of see a split in the scholarly terms of that first initiative. I feel like scholars of what would be called area studies, or people who study Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and so on, have done some important work to, a part of it comes out of the institutional conversations about the relationship between Latin American studies and Latinx studies, about thinking of how regional histories necessarily relate to migration, diaspora, mobility. I think it's hard for a straight-up history of Cuba these days to sort of overlook the idea of diaspora and mobility and migration. In terms of U.S. scholars of 1898 and U.S. foreign relations, I think they still have some work to do. There's still a kind of stuck on themselves mentality. I don't know if you've seen the 1898 exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery in DC, where I live. It's an amazing exhibit. But there was a symposium around it that included many scholars of, say, US art history or US visual culture. And I think they kind of left the impression that the worst thing that happened in 1898 was that a US reading public was exposed to racist political cartoons, right? And the idea that the effects of 1898 and US intervention in other parts of the world are just kind of secondary to the thinking about the self-reflections on what it means to be an empire. And to the second initiative about the transnational scholarly community, this one is, I really lament that this hasn't borne fruit as in the case of Cuba, and that's in part because many Cubans leave. It's in part because many Cuban institutions sort of limit the research agenda, and US institutions. The idea that there would be kind of equally weighted institutional communities, right, is not always recognized by, say, US funders who would understand that you need to support Cuban institutions in order to have that dialogue work. Everything from internet access to sort of reciprocal travel funds, not for US scholars just to go to Cuba, but in reverse. All of this kind of has left me thinking about my mobility and migration. So my first book was sort of leading up to 1898 and thinking about politics in Cuba that aren't exhausted by national citizenship. They might be inclusive of them, but it's neither about Cuban nationalism that's sort of squarely resisting or looking at US imperialism, or a kind of US imprint on, it's about pro-Spanish loyalty and the racial politics that come out of that. And among those politics are questions of mobility, who gets to move around and how and why. And that sort of led to my current project, which is about mobility politics. So think of a long history of being documented and undocumented, what those terms mean. Passports have a history that predates the consolidation of national borders and citizenship regimes. So it's precisely the function of passports in and across imperial spaces that brings into focus a mobility politics that isn't so overdetermined by the nation state and by so-called international relations among US and European powers. Maybe we could go to the next slide. But among those, within the kind of US foreign relations world, this would be an archetypical example of why to foreground passports. This is Clara Barton's passport in 1898 to go to Cuba. If you can go to the next slide, you see the detail. It's for distributing money and supplies to the suffering people of Cuba. And what the sort of modest scholarship on the history of passports is really from an international relations perspective about how the United States and European nations, and then by extension the rest of the world in this sort of trickle-down effect, consolidated these regimes. I'm much more interested in the fuzziness and the instability of the meaning of passports before national borders and national citizenship became so clearly linked to them. So maybe we can go to the next slide. This is the Havana harbor. So you can see it between the age of sail and steam. This is in the middle of the 19th century. The kind of traffic coming in and out of Havana isn't just about, so if you read travel accounts, this is mostly about Europeans arriving and not so much about Cubans leaving, but this is a multi-directional flow of migration and mobility. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is just among the show and tell. This is an 1829 passport issued by the Captain General of Cuba in a kind of passport office. It's for a natural. It's for someone from Portugal to go to New Orleans. So if you just to underscore that this isn't necessarily about national belonging, or that passports sort of have remnants of earlier sort of safe pass letters of recommendation, like some letters of commendation. That are about, say, like encouraging any official to give safe passage to this person, but not necessarily protecting him as a citizen of the Spanish Empire or a subject of the Spanish Empire. Those are the that's the sort of haziness that I'm interested in. Maybe we could go to the next slide. And the main source are these. This is a book that's about 3 feet by 1.5 feet. The dimensions are hard to see, but these are the libros de pasaportes in the Cuban National Archive, and they record every passport issued in Havana from about the 1820s to 1898. And they start as sort of loose leaf notebooks, and by the time in the 1850s, steam travel, the volume of transit is so big. These volumes I just had to stop looking at after a while, because there's a woman in her 60s who brings documents to one's table in the archives, and it's at a certain point someone's physical health is more important than my access to these passport books. But they really are fascinating. If we can go to the next slide. They both tell you so much and so little, right? It's a register of the names, places of origin and destinations, and then the passport number of the person who's applying. And it just gives you a sense of the range of people, the scale and scope of travel. Maybe we can go to the next slide. The only reason I was able to photograph this Libro de Pasaportes is because if you see the 6th entry down for December 21st is Jose Marti. This is the passport issued to Jose Marti when he was exiled to Spain during the 10 Years' War. This is not the point of my project, but it gets Cuban scholars very excited and Cuban archivists very excited. This was a new fact discovered about Jose Marti. So part of this is sort of looking at the actual materiality of passports, but it's also about kind of the life history of those documents, sort of where they travel over time and what they mean to the bearers who hold them, right? There's a lack of stability about what passports mean, but it's very clear that many people want them and many officials are eager to distribute them. So there's this convergence without necessarily a stable understanding of what the passports are for. If we can go to the next slide. And then what those registers don't necessarily tell us are the names of many other people. So this is an internal pass, not a passport to travel abroad. But you can see it's for Jose Quesada, and the slave whose name is expressed on the back. So if you can go to the next slide, right, there's Teodoro, who's a natural of the Congo, right? He doesn't get his own passport. His name, often the names of wives, daughters, children, dependents of men, are simply written on the back or on the bottom of passports. So, to look at this historical record as a story of people moving about and how Cubans leave Cuba, it's a partial history that obscures a lot of actors who are considered legal minors. The sort of struggles around 1898, right? If you read the U.S. press, they talk about Cuban refugees, and what they're referring to are U.S. consuls who are trying to leave Cuba because the U.S. has decided to intervene, and Spain is not happy with those consuls. So there's kind of an erasure in the U.S. press of like why Cubans themselves would want to be circulating, and the sort of passport regime around it, like leading up to 1898, actually the volume increases, and it's not that the institution breaks down, it's sort of revved up by the war. And it's when you look at that record, you see just how much of the story of 1898 is not simply about Cubans leaving for the United States or going back and forth to the United States. They're going to Mexico, they're going to the Dominican Republic, they're going to Haiti, they're going all over. It's a nice reminder that a lot of the exile organizing in the War of Independence was done in Mexico as much as it was done in the United States. It just tells a different story about 1898. And it's a story, this passport record is relevant to today. If we can go to the next slide. This is a typical day outside the Spanish embassy in Havana. This is in Habana Vieja. The long lines are of people who are applying for Spanish passports with the idea of leaving Cuba with them. So Spain's laws of national reconciliation in 2007, and then there was an updated one in 2022, just last year, gives Cubans who can prove Spanish ancestry, we can get into the details of that, it's a little complicated, but it's an opportunity to obtain a Spanish passport. So in the first wave after 2007, about 150,000 Cubans obtained Spanish passports. But if you think about that, if we can just turn to the next slide, it involves documenting one's Spanish ancestry. And what it binds people to is that same colonial record. If we can go to the next slide, right? These same libros de pasaportes, the ones that I gave up on because they were too heavy, are now being hauled out by archival staff, by people who are looking to document a relative who can be identified, if you can go to the next slide, in that third column as being of Spanish origin, right? To prove that they left Cuba, but as a Spaniard, right? And this is part of the paper trail. It's rarely the end point, but it's often the starting point, either to get access to a civil registry in Spain. Sometimes this is research done on behalf of elderly relatives who might be able to get an EU pension, with about $200 a year for living abroad, which it's much higher than a Cuban salary these days, right? So there are all kinds of purposes these passports are put to, as was the case in the 19th century. If we can go to the next slide. It means that in our digital and connected world, there are Cubans who sift through paper still, right? I guess I have less of a conclusion than just a concluding tension. It's between recognizing the importance of these paper trails to people's lived experiences without reducing it simply to a story of empire, U.S. empire, national citizenship, and so on. So this is an installation from the Museo de Bellas Artes in Havana several years ago. If you can go to the next slide. This is called Palimpsesto by Jose Manuel Force, and it's just a room full of stacks of paper and the kind of papers and paper trails that make up a person's life, right? Letters, notes, but they're also emancipation. There are letters of freedom in this. There are passports among these stacks, right? The point can't be that all of those stacks of paper only or primarily add up to national citizenship or a right to travel. Think about everything else that's effaced when we do that. There's sort of the talk these days in Cuba is that there's history fatigue and a genealogical craze, right? That the sort of national narratives of the revolution and the revolution doing the unfinished work of 1898 have frustrated people in the current crisis, the economic crisis that has them wanting to leave Cuba and looking for Spanish passports to do so. Linking that genealogical craze to the uneven and differential mobilities today and in the past, right? This is a nicer reminder that this has moorings that push us well past the legacy of US empire and right through to the present. Thanks. Oh, you can go to just the next slide. This is just to tee up future conversations, but Adal Maldonado, this Puerto Rican artist in 1994, establishes the Puerto Rican embassy, and this is one of his passports that sort of imagines what a passport regime for a sovereign Puerto Rico might look like. Thanks.
Hafiday, mabuhay everyone. I'm Kristen Oberiano, assistant professor at Wesleyan in the history department. I'm a professor of US 20th century history. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Spanish Empire in Guam, but this is me dabbling in those archives, not necessarily fully engaging with them. So if you have any feedback from me as to how I can do this better, I'd really love that, as this is part of my book project that I hopefully will submit to peer review in the next few months, and I'm wrapping up doing these small edits to this first chapter of that book. Well, thank you again, first to Matthew for organizing all of us. This is a fantastic opportunity to get to share my work with others and get to learn from all of you. And I'm also really looking forward to our conversations, David and Jose, later on. So I don't have any slides, but today I'll be presenting on details. So details that have been overlooked in the historical narrative of US imperialism in the Pacific at the turn of the 20th century. So here are a few examples for you to get a small sense of what I'm talking about. In Moon Ho Jung's latest book, published in 2021, Menace to the Empire, he wrote this phrase, quote, "Ricarte faced years of imprisonment and exile. US officials deported him to Guam, another former Spanish colony now claimed by the United States, where they hoped he would consider his allegiances. In February 1903, they took him back to the Philippines," end quote. In Paul Kramer's Blood of Government, Kramer writes that US General Arthur MacArthur, quote, "ordered the deportation to Guam of prominent and popular agitators, including Apolinario Mabini. The indefinite incarceration or deportation of prisoners was a self-consciously terror-generating strategy," end quote. And he ends explanation there. And lastly, in Jose Rizal's No Me Tangerine, he gives us a sense as to this longer history of exile in this one-off sentence. Quote, "Let us give thanks to the Lord our God that you are not in the Mariana Islands planting sweet potatoes," end quote. So rather than skipping the details like these previous authors and writers, I examine the relationships forged between Filipino exiles and the indigenous Chamorro people of Guam in this transition of Spanish and US imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. By narrating the history of Guam and the Philippines starting in the Spanish imperial era, a time before the Philippines was solidified into a nation state, before Guam was considered a US territory, before the Philippines and Guam were split by American imperial policy, this presentation highlights the grounded intimacies of Chamorros and Filipinos who were trying to negotiate an increasingly uncertain world they lived in, a world of imperial transitions, of shifting geopolitical power, and of colonial revolutions. So as I mentioned before, this is the first chapter of my book project, Territorial Discontent, Chamorros, Filipinos, and the Making of US Empire in Guam. And in this 100-year history from 1898 to 1997, I examine how the United States empire develops into a military colonialism or settler militarism over the 20th century, and how this influenced the relationships between Chamorros and Filipinos in that time. So going back to some historical background, the Mariana Islands of Guam of which Guam is the southernmost island, was considered a province of the Philippines since the 16th century, I believe. Between the late 16th and early 19th century, Guam was a stopping point between Acapulco and Manila in Spain's famed Manila galleons, which transported goods, people, and gold across the Pacific for nearly 250 years. Apra Harbor in Guam and the adjacent Chamorro village of Sumay became the hub of global trade and commerce for the whole of the Micronesian region. The circulation of military officers, soldiers, merchants, and intellectuals between the Philippines and the Marianas was relatively consistent. The Chamorro elite had access to colonial economic and social networks that spanned the Spanish Empire. For instance, Chamorro elites from Guam sent their children to universities and had connections to trade in the Philippines. This includes famous Catholic priest Padre Jose Palomo, who is known to be the first Chamorro priest and is sort of an emblematic figure in this transition of empire. With the circulation of colonial subjects moving throughout the Pacific, the Chamorro people cultivated their distinct cosmopolitan political philosophy that was influenced by events in the Philippines and the rest of the Spanish Pacific. So by the end of the 19th century, Spanish colonial officials started to use Guam as a penal colony. In the 1860s, Guam and the Mariana Islands became one of 4 penitentiaries across the Spanish Pacific, and Guam received 3 waves of exiles from the Philippines. The first of convict labor in the mid-19th century, the second comprised of Filipino deportees from the 1872 Cavite Mutiny, and then last in the 1890s, who were the most fervent of the revolutionaries who carried their own motivations to the island. While some exiles were wealthy and educated, there were several hundred ordinary Filipino soldiers, laborers, and servants who ended up putting a strain on the finite resources of Guam in that period. Many of these ordinary Filipinos were considered dangerous and violent and had potentials for throwing an insurrection at any moment. I can share an excerpt here of of an event that demonstrates this. I have time, right? Okay, let's do it. So let me find that. Most notably, in September 11th, 1896, 56 prisoners arrived on the island after they were captured in Manila during the Revolt for Independence. So this is a quote. In December, 207 more rebel soldiers arrived at Apra Harbor in Guam. 2 Chamorro men overheard that the prisoners, quote, intended to kill the entire Spanish population, plus any Chamorros who interfered, end quote. After a thwarted attempt to escape one night, the next morning, prisoners clambered onto the rafters to escape through the roof or threw themselves onto the prison doors. The island's resident friar recorded in his diary, quote, the Chamorro artillerymen held to their posts, shouting at them at close range, and they fell to the ground, and shooting continued for some time. Word of the escaping prisoners spread to the people of Hagana, which is the capital village, and, quote, armed with shotguns, machetes, and clubs, they were congregated at the vicinity of the prison to fight against Filipino prisoners. The friar continued, quote, when the prison doors were opened, there before our eyes was a horrible sight. 80 persons lay dead and 45 wounded, sprawled on the floor, bathed in their own blood, end quote. So the presence of these rebellious and violent Filipino deportados shaped the perspectives of the Chamorro elites when it came to Filipinos. And many of these elites despised the ordinary Filipinos who came to the island. While there were those ordinary Filipinos, there were exiles who represented some of the leading liberal individuals of the Philippine Revolution. This wave included 22 upper-class and educated revolutionaries who arrived on the island in 1872. These men were then distributed among the elite houses in Hagana, including the home of Padre Palomo. And they were at the center of city life in Guam, making it very possible that they conversed about colonialism, exchanged political philosophies, as well as strategies and tactics for imperial reform and anti-colonial rebellion. Chamorro elites took advantage and used the opportunity to create diplomatic networks that could then aid them in the future. This network, however, does not mean Chamorros merely adopted to Filipino anti-colonial beliefs. As pointed out by one historian, Carlos Madrid at the University of Guam, Chamorros had their own experiences in the Marianas that shaped their own political ideologies. Filipino perspectives instead, quote, added to an already existing political dynamic, end quote. Nonetheless, the presence of these elite Filipinos provided the foundations for an intellectual network of Filipinos and Chamorros for the transition of empire. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So after the Spanish-American War and during the U.S. era of the Philippine Revolution, U.S. General Arthur MacArthur caught Apolinario Mabini sending correspondence to the last holdouts of the Philippine Revolution while he was imprisoned in Manila. Subsequently, MacArthur labeled Mabini and his fellow revolutionaries as dangerous to U.S. state-building efforts in the archipelago. As a result, MacArthur deemed Mabini's deportation absolutely essential. So on the 14th of January 1901, the governor of Guam received word that they would incarcerate Filipino prisoners of war. Among them, quote, are some of the most influential leaders of the insurrectionist party in this island, end quote. 10 days later, Mabini arrived on the shores of Guam aboard the USS Rosencrantz and brought to a former leper colony in the village of Asin. This demonstrates how the US had used pre-existing Spanish colonial infrastructure and carceral strategies for their own colonial mission. Despite the prison's isolation from the capital village of Pagania, Chamorros soon made their way to visit the Filipino exiles, whose lives were, quote, so boring, according to Mabini. The visitors included Spanish mestizos from the prominent families of the district, including Padre Palomo. Palomo celebrated Mass on at least 2 occasions in 1901 and presided over the Catholic burials of 2 Filipino prisoners who died in exile. Palomo's seeming ubiquitousness in both the Spanish, American, and Filipino archives point to this continuing network that existed between the Filipino and the Chamorro elite. Furthermore, according to Mabini's diaries, the Chamorro community was willing to step in when the prisoners' food supplies ran low. Chamorros often brought different fresh vegetables, chicken, fish, and milk from their ranches. To me, this also signals a small integration into the Chamorro local networks of obligation and reciprocity. Slowly, Mabini's diaries and letters became more detailed with peoples from the local community. Mabini wrote about a night with the Herrero and Martinez families in July 1901. According to Mabini, they, quote, they are Spanish mestizos and their children are the prettiest in Hagåtña. They enjoyed a night filled with dance and music and a show of the most powerful voice in all of Hagåtña. So they were having like lives, even in imprisonment and incarceration. According to a 1961 news article in the Territorial Sun, one of the writer wrote this phrase, in fact, during their 19th-month stay here, the more prominent of the Filipinos hobnobbed with island society and were accepted by some of the most prominent families. So in fact, the lechonadas that were organized during this time of exile were remembered decades later after they occurred and then recorded down in oral histories. So these day-to-day intimacy shows the lives lived in exiles and during imperial transition as well. So while the Filipino exiles were incarcerated in Guam, the Chamorro elite crafted their own petition to send to the United States. So we can see like these 2 parallel trends of Philippine Revolution and what's happening in Guam with this petition. In December 1901, 32 prominent members of the Island Society requested a survey to study the needs of our peoples with instructions to formulate and present to Congress for its action such measures it may deem advisable for the establishment of a permanent government. They criticized the improvisational nature of US imperial rule in Guam, including criticizing the naval governor who, quote, exercises supreme power in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, with absolutely no limitations to his actions, end quote. Instead, the Chamorro elite sought more representation in colonial affairs. They even went on to mention about how they had more rights during the Spanish Empire than they did with the US in Guam in this time. Which is fascinating. So this petition was one of the first of many Guamanian petitions sent to the United States. I'm using Guamanian here because there were some folks on that petition who were actually American navals, like officers. And I was just like, oh, that's a really interesting, group of people who decided to sign on to this. The signers, which included Padre Palomo, a Martinez, a Herrero, and a Justo Dunca, wrote to U.S. Congress hoping that more attention would be paid to Guam and that certainty would be given to their colonial status. So a Chamorro political philosophy emerged in tandem with the Philippine Revolution. I didn't get too much into it, but then I think this petition is evidence of that. And although the petition was conservative in its outcomes, it didn't ask for complete independence or didn't ask for anything that is substantial. It was just wanting to ask for a survey. Its authors must have learned so much from the experiences of the Filipino revolutionaries nonetheless, and sought their own forms of diplomacy to ensure the best outcome for their islands and themselves. By 1902, Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed the end of the Philippine insurrection and pardoned the Filipino exiles, provided that they made an oath of allegiance to the United States. So Artemio Ricarte refused to take the oath, and he never did, opting to relocate to various countries across Asia instead. Mabini also did not take the oath, but finally acquiesced once he realized that his health was failing considerably. So he took the oath, moved back to the Philippines, but passed away a few short months after that. So almost all the exiles returned to the Philippines of this US exile thing. But then 3 men stayed. So they were Maximo Tolentino, Leon Flores, and Pancracio Palting. And they decided to stay on Guam because of the strong connections they made with US naval officials and the island's elite too. The 3 exiles turned settlers became part of the US naval government on Guam, Tolentino as a messenger, and Flores and Palting as island attorneys. Flores and Palting's command of the Spanish language and knowledge of the Spanish colonial system, crucial skills needed in the transition of empires, placed them at the top of the naval government's civil servant bureaucracy. If Flores and Palting were previously against the US empire in the Philippines, they were now integral parts of its colonial infrastructure on Guam. But it wasn't just the imperial bureaucracy that tied them to the island. It was also the local women they married and that made them stay. Tolentino married a local girl, Tommaso Crisostomo Lizama, in 1906 and had a family. And in 1904, Leon Flores married Felicita Dunca, and Pancracio Palting married Soledad Dunca. They were both daughters of Don Justo Dunca, who was one of those signers of that petition. With Flores and Palting marrying into the local elite Dunca family, they started a line of local Chamorro leaders with Filipino heritage, including the first Chamorro Archbishop of Guam, Felix Berto Flores. So now my presentation today, there were just a few examples of what happens when we look into the details. Overlooked histories are revealed that can tell us something about imperial transitions, imperial networks, and the people who had to live through them. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
It's a tough act to follow. These 2 brilliant historians. Now, I just want to preface my talk with a caveat, which is that I think Matthew thinks that I am a 19th century historian. And I mean, I don't take an issue with that, but I only took like 2 history classes in college, and my PhD's in critical ethnic studies. So I think of myself as a interdisciplinary historian and also an indisciplinado historian. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about more the philosophy of history questions that are behind the title of this symposium, or this section of the symposium. And I want to begin with an anecdote. David, I'm glad that you brought up 1998, because in 1998, I was in Puerto Rico that summer, back from my first year of college. And I had 2 jobs, and I would go back and forth between them. So I was doing a lot of driving and listening to the radio. One of them, I worked at a quick loop, no relevance to this talk. The other one, I worked at an archaeological dig because I was training to be an archaeologist, which is how I started my career in academia. And while we were excavating some Taino, Yucayeque, and Caguas, the radio was abuzz with all this debate about the memory of 1898 and the centennial. I remember the controversy around Norma Burgos, who I believe was Secretary of State, and she wrote a column in Nuevo Dia about how historians really need to tell the true story of what happened in 1898, because everybody welcomed the U.S. forces with open arms, and they were just fulfilling the wish of the Puerto Rico section of the Partido Revolucionario Cubano. Julio José Gena was basically pleading with the president to invade Puerto Rico, and blah, blah, blah. And then there was the really fuming independentista response to this, which is this is a calumny, this is a lie. We all need to go to Huánica, the site where the military invasion happened. This was a real military invasion, and we all need to go there and have a big protest, you know. And I wasn't really thinking about these things that much back then. I remember thinking, wow, history is complicated, you know. I'm glad that I'm an archaeologist because, you know, we're dealing with objective kind of material remains. So I guess that's not my problem. And then the following summer, and the following summer after that, 2 summers after that, I worked in an archaeological excavation 7 kilometers from the Gaza Strip in Ashkelon. And that was really a slap across the face as to how politicized archaeology can be too. Because even though we were trying to be objective archaeologists, you had like the people that are trying to prove the Bible and the people that are trying to prove Zionist claims to that area, which, by the way, I was thinking, wow, I don't think this was ever part of the Kingdom of Judea, Ashkelon, which is part of the whole region that is being horribly contested right now. The lesson that I took from that, and this is partly why I pivoted towards what I do now, is that these battles over historical memory are inevitable. They conscript us, right? They have powerful political consequences in the present and future. The other point that I want to make is that the terrain in which we fight those battles is really tricky. It's really messy, right? It's not something, there's a lot of fog. There's a lot of fog in that battle, right? So I want to begin with my trouble with the title. Not trouble, it's not a bad thing, but my own kind of internal annoying dialogue about the title, Afterlives of 1898. When I read that, I was thinking, afterlife, does that mean that it's kind of like an organism that just kind of lives on and on like a ghost or like a zombie? And I had issues with that because when I think of 1898, I think of many organisms kind of flowing through that, and many of them not very easy to bind, to abstract. And then I thought, well, this comes from, I mean, pardon me if I'm getting the genealogy wrong, but I believe that Saidiya Hartman is largely responsible for placing that term in our vocabularies. And then I went back to Saidiya Hartman, Lose Your Mother, and I noticed that she tends to use it more in the singular, the afterlife of slavery or the afterlife of property. But she talks about different locations, so I thought, well, maybe the way she intends it is there's this thing, slavery. We can strategically abstract, put boundaries around that, and it happens in different sites. So I guess when it's plural, it's that thing happening in different sites. That's kind of how Christina Sharp uses it. She uses afterlives. And then I thought, but I'm not satisfied with that, because what is that thing in 1898, that thing that lives beyond time in the Philippines, in Guam, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in all these places? I see a lot of things in there. So that got me to question really to apply a kind of philosophical historical critique to the question itself, right? If we're going to be conscripted into this battle over the memory of 1898, because it tends to really flare up every century or every 25 years, what shape and what substance are we going to try to give it? Because the shape and substance also have a bearing in the uses and abuses of that memory, right? So we have to do the work of getting in archives and narrativizing it into history, but we also have to decide what shape and what substance we're going to track, to give it, to conceptualize. And this is important because the shape can vary. The shape can, first of all, it could be plurals, right? We have to be very careful with the ruse of linear teleologies, right? From a decolonial studies perspective, from a philosophical perspective, these are artifices of the modern colonial episteme, right? There's a kind of neatness to it that is hyper abstracted, and that really reinforces certain things that we can think of as very problematic, as very colonial, as very imperial, right? For example, the idea first of all, the purification, the glorification of the individual, right? And that the individual has different scales of being, right? You have the individual, the nuclear family, the community, the nation, blah, 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 and that they all move through linear time. And there's so many, when you think about coloniality, right, in terms of the ideological layer of colonialisms and imperialisms, so much of it relies on that abstraction, right? So how can we think of the afterlives of 1898 with a different shape, with a shape that doesn't think of 1898 as a kind of funnel that linear history just kind of passes through, right? We can think of it perhaps, there's this messy kind of river of historical phenomena, and we can maybe put a bottle with a funnel attached to it and pick up some of it, some of what's flowing, and think, well, there's 1898, but there's a lot of stuff that is going through it. And I know that I sound really woo-woo right now, so I'm going to try to give it some historical specificity. Right now in Puerto Rico, there's a vibrant movement, really questioning the privatization of everything, particularly by this horrible Law 20, Law 22, Law 60 that gives settlers, basically, tax incentives to come to Puerto Rico and buy everything up. And it's on the news. If you're a lefty person, you read about these things all the time, and you're really angry about it. From a historical perspective, that reminds me so much of La Real Cédula de Gracia of 1812 and all the different ramifications that have in the 19th century. Many of my ancestors, I think of myself as super Boricua, right? Born and raised in Puerto Rico, my parents too. I have ancestors that go back beyond tracing in the archives. But many of my ancestors came because of the tax incentives that European Catholics would get in the 19th century to come to Puerto Rico. And in many ways, my race and class privileges are attached to those boosts, that they got. So in many ways, 3 or 4 generations ago, my ancestors were not that different than these Ley 22, Ley 60. And this is not a new thing that the Americans invented, is my point. This is something that goes back to Spanish colonialism, right? So there's something that lives through 1898, but emerged well before 1898. It's inflected by 1898 because all these things have to adapt to the changing circumstances, the vicissitudes. Besides questioning kind of the singular linear timeline, there's also there are also questions. I mean, I'm very interested in transcolonial relationality. I'm very interested in tracing these transnational connections. But I also worry that sometimes we think of relationality, transcolonial relationality in a historical perspective. We think of it sometimes in this very vague, unproductive way. It's like this cosmic thing. Oh, relationality. We're all interrelated, And I know that I'm being a little bit facetious there, but there are people that give it more nuance than that. But that's not satisfactory to me. So I've tried to think of this in terms of the structural forces that connect a place like Guam and the Philippines to Puerto Rico, Cuba. But I've tried to historicize that, to tell the story of that. But that's very difficult because, again, when you think of the shape and the substance of history, it's hard to really put bookends around that. What precisely are the things that interconnect, right? And And when you add to that the layer of 1898, how many of those things directly emanate from 1898? How many of those things emanate from other things, pass through it? So I struggled to find an anchor to that. And then I remembered the work of somebody who, by the way, nobody told me that Rocio Zambrana was going to be here, and I was going to cite the hell out of her book. So that's another reason why I'm a little bit nervous, but hopefully I'll get an A minus. There's a very interesting way of framing the things that live after, through, and that have to do with colonialism and imperialism and coloniality. And that is through the optic of, I guess we can call it debt, although it's a little bit more than that, because even the term debt circumscribes it to a particular type of obligation, right? So what I want us to think about are the things that flow through 1898 that have to do with ledger debts, right? Which are these legitimized asymmetries of power, unpayable debts, many of them, that are legitimized by either Spanish colonial law or later US law, the state, right? And counter to that, all the other unregistered, unrecorded, unledgered, asymmetric takings that were never really accounted for, right? And when I think of those things, I think of many of those flowing through 1898. I think many of those resulting from 1898, many of those becoming much more complicated through 1898, but flowing through 1898. And I think, and Rocio's book does a masterful job, everybody should read it, Colonial Debts, of really showing the gray area that exists between colonial imperialism, global capitalism, and not to think that it invites us to stay away from a stages kind of very staid dialectical materialism that thinks that somehow there was an event long ago where there was a switch on the wall and somebody switched from like primitive accumulation to liberal capitalist accumulation, right? There's a lot of ongoing pillaging under liberal capitalist accumulation. And in many ways, liberalism deludes us into seeing that taking, right? It creates a kind of self-disciplined colonial subject, right? Where very much like the idea of the legitimate lender and the legitimate borrower, the borrower that is unable to pay being a delinquent, right? And the lender being a victim, right? It makes us think of ourselves as colonial subjects, and within Puerto Rico, within its hierarchies of power, as bad people because we can't afford to live, we can't afford to pay, we can't afford to have access to land. There's all these other people that can afford it. We can't afford it. We have personal debt, we have national debt, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many other asymmetrical borrowings that we could account for. So what I'm thinking in terms of 1898 is that rather than doing what we were doing in 1998, which was, the debate as to whether the U.S. was this liberating democratic force or a sadistic pillaging empire that screwed everybody, we can have a more nuanced, multi-layered conversation. Not to deny the power of the U.S. metropole and U.S. federal law. There's so many ways in which you can write that into history, how that really complicated class relations, race relations in Puerto Rico. So just to wrap up, here are some ways in which I would try to do that, to try to fulfill that praxis of reconceptualizing the shape and substance of what lives after 1898. And these are ideas that you're welcome to poach. I mean, I might write about them someday or not, who knows. One that we could do, you know, I'm a firm believer too that when we think about either modern colonialism in Puerto Rico or post-colonialism, we have to think of it not as kind of this flat object, but really as a kind of Russian doll, as a nested thing. There's many different power relationships inside of it that enable it, right? And Rocio Zambrana's book definitely treats it as such. For example, she writes about patriarchy, right, and how it's a kind of it's a lender, unpaying borrower kind of ruse, right? So we have many different, and this is also a Fanonian way of thinking about how the matrix of colonialism infuses itself into so many different aspects in a colonized population, in the psyche and interpersonal relations, etc. Right? So we have many different nested relationships of power inside Puerto Rico, right? One that I would like to unravel, or others to unravel, is intergenerational race and class privilege that goes back to well before 1898, and how it flows through 1898 and modifies through 1898 and adapts, complicates itself, right? And this is something that we could do to most of those other sites of Spanish Empire turned into US Empire. Another one, and this is also a very Fanonian takeaway, is, and I'm gonna cite David Sartorius here too, because your book made me think about this when I read it, is the flow of infracolonial, low intensity civil warfare. Right? When you read, and correct me if I'm misreading your book, because I read it a long time ago, but when you read David's book about the last independence war in Cuba, one of the things that became like really clicked in my head when I read that was, wow, sometimes we tend to think of the independence war as like the valiant Cuban insurgency versus the horrible gachupines Spaniards who are just like walking around Cuba after they disembarked. But when you read his book, you realize that there were a lot of Cubans that were supporting Spain and fighting for Spain. And in many ways, Cuba's independence wars were also civil wars, right? And these were civil wars not just about political status, but they were civil wars about race and race privilege too, right? I remember reading something by the brilliant Jose Luis Gonzalez, and I was trying to find the quote, but that book is not digitized because it's old and I don't have it, so I couldn't find the quote. But it goes something like, in the 80s, it was in his book about País de los Cuatro Pisos, but there's like a return to País de los Cuatro Pisos, and he's reflecting about how the dynamic between the police and poor criminalized youth in Puerto Rico, this is early mano dura, you know, was a kind of low-intensity civil conflict, right? And we've had these. I mean, if you think of Fernando Picó's work on in that book, 1898, about the revanchist violence of the tiznados against the hacienda owners, right? And how the U.S. troops found themselves in this weird position where they had to basically prevent the former workers from potentially lynching their former employers, right? Or burning down their hacienda, right? And with a lot of legitimate anger and grievance, because it was a very exploitative labor system that existed in Puerto Rico before 1898. And the third one that I want to end with, this is one more closer to what I'm working on right now. It's really weird for me to be in this building, in this area, because right now I'm writing a chapter about some Black Cubans and Puerto Ricans that, and this follows also Jesse Hovnung's Racial Migrations book, so it expands some of that work, that created what we could think of as an organized proto-Afro-Latino politics in the United States. These were Black Cubans, mulatto Cubans, Black and mixed race Puerto Ricans that under Spanish law were considered clases de color at that time, right? So they organized as a kind of Afro-descended people of color solidarity thing. And they were actually, one of the key events was this thing called La Liga, which was supposed to be a kind of night school, but it really was kind of like a political education center. And it was right around here. It's like a block from here. This is before NYU existed, by the way. 1890s. It didn't exist here. Anyway, so one of the things that they were writing about was Afro-Cubans, Afro-Boricuas need to get organized with each other because our relatives back home never got a reconstruction from slavery, right? So these were people that came to the U.S. during Reconstruction. A lot of them came through Key West, which was a key hub of Reconstruction, at the peak of Reconstruction there. And they were really inspired by not the top-down Freedmen's Bureau stuff, but what Tulani Davis has written about in terms of the emancipation circuit, which is like all this autogestión, civil society organizing. And they thought to themselves, wow, well, first of all, back home, some of my relatives are still enslaved because 1873 in Puerto Rico, 1886 in Cuba. But also, presuming that there's going to be abolition, where's the reconstruction? So they were basically trying to get rid of Spanish colonialism so that a new, presumably amicable sovereign government would allow them to put into effect something as close to Reconstruction as possible. They would call it regeneración, a regeneration. And it's also a kind of borrowing of this whole like new Negro. I mean, that language was already circulating. These are also the first people that used the term Afro-Cuban, right? 1890s, right here, Greenwich Village, Little Africa, right? So I'm very interested to think of what happened to that, because I would argue that is a history that has to do a lot with 1898. 1898 was a pivotal event in terms of blocking that, because the US invaded right after Plessy versus Ferguson and the crackdown on any kind of reconstruction. But that's another example of something that predates 1898 and kind of flows through it, what happened to it, right? So that's all the time that I have. I'm excited about the conversation, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Jose, David, and Kristen. I think we have a lot to talk about. I hope folks on Zoom get your questions ready. So we'll have a quick discussion, and then we'll switch over to Q&A. Okay, so where should we begin? I wanted this to be a discussion amongst the four of us. So I do want to give time toward the end of the discussion for each of you to ask each other questions that you may have for each other. But listening to each of your talks, I was thinking maybe we can divvy up the conversation into perhaps two smaller discussions. One about rethinking that centennial moment, thinking about what histories of 1898 have continued to not be thought of or have not been explored or studied. And I think the other side and then the second discussion, I think, is an important one that I think Jose brings up, and this is something that I hope that we get to talk about through the course of the symposium, is why 1898, and do we continue to reify it as this kind of landmark, especially we consider, I mean, what's so remarkable about 1898 when you kind of position it within a longer history of settler colonialism, genocide, forced migration, and displacement. And so in looking at it from that lens, I mean, 1898 just looks like a one node in a really kind of larger, it's a larger picture. So let's start. Let's start with the first, because I think Kristen and David, you really really think through these national paradigmatic ways of thinking about histories, whether it is of Cuba, and and the Philippines or Guam. It's I'm I'm a cultural studies scholar of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and when I think about the Philippines, it's like I know these nationalist histories, like Mabini was such like he's like a foundational figure. He's like one of these founding fathers of Philippine nationalism, and yet I think Kristen's right. He spent 2 years in Guam, and I think within Philippine history, it's just a minor footnote. It's like, hey, he was in Guam for 2 years, and that was it. He came back to the Philippines, and then that was it. And so I think it's really great that you're bringing out these kind of interconnected histories. And so that said, I'll keep the question simple of why 1898? What's missing? Why does it matter? Just simple question. But I'll leave it up to any three of you who wants to go first.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So it's such a giant question to start off the day, but I'm gonna answer it in a very detailed, sort of specific way. So when I went about starting this project, I'm Filipino, born and raised on Guam, amongst a very multicultural group of people, including a lot of Chamorro friends. And back when I started thinking about doing a history project as an undergrad, there was a moment between my junior and senior year where Chamorro Filipino tensions became manifested in this event where a elder Chamorro U.S. military veteran went up to the Apolinario Mabini statue in Guam and slammed it with a sledgehammer, and talked about how Mabini was not patriotic to the United States, and that why are we on Guam, Chamorro Island, having this monument to him? And I thought that, and then my friend Josephine Faith Ong also thinks about this in her master's thesis. And so I thought this was a really interesting moment to think about Chamorro Filipino tensions and what does it mean to be in this space where imperialism is different. There's different empires, there's different nations, there's different notions of identity and belonging, all wrapped up around this 1898 moment, but then also in 20 whatever teens that year was. And so that's what sort of got me to start thinking about that, like how these tensions, even if they're 125 years ago, yet it still end up being really relevant today for Guam. Yeah, I'll stop there and we can talk about that a little bit more if you want to. But yeah.
I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is that I'm teaching a history of slavery in Latin America course right now, and I was just yesterday complaining to students about the 1619 project and how it could just as easily be the 1519 project or the 1492 project, or the list goes on and on. If you like widen out beyond the United States and think of slavery as an Atlantic phenomenon, that 1619 is not the starting point, but I guess one way to think of it is like, what would the 1898 project look like? And it wouldn't be in English, or it wouldn't be exclusively in English. I think that would be the first major difference. I also feel like it really depends what our endpoints are and what we imagine. Like, it's in a non-linear fashion, like what we're really looking for. And is this still a reflection on US power? And I guess I was just reading this book by Ray Craib called Adventure Capitalism, it's a history of libertarian exit. So these are those ultra rich people who are seasteading right now and making spaceship plans because they're not about, they see the writing on the wall, and it's about leaving how capitalism has ravaged our world. He traces this history back to the Guano Islands right, disputes over the Guano Islands, which that's not a story of 1898. It's an 1840s story. It's a trans-Pacific story. Like the geography is completely different than an 1898 geography. It's a different chronology, and it has a much different endpoint in mind. This isn't about U.S. power. This is about people richer than all of us combined making decisions that have nothing to do with the U.S. government.
I want to read that. um, so one thing that I had the blessing of having the opportunity to move to the West Coast, to San Diego, when I was in my mid-20s. I went to graduate school with a really heterogeneous cohort of people. One of my colegas was Chamorro, for example, Miguel, Michael Lujan Bebacua. And I learned a lot about Guam, and we compared a lot of notes. There's a lot of Filipinos in San Diego, made a lot of friends, compared a lot of notes, and was always very impressed with the Filipino youth activism there. And it made me, and also living next to the border, you see kind of the brutality of nation-state centrism, right? And this insistence that there are these nations that are bounded and all that. So I became exposed as I became maybe a little bit post-nationalist, although I understand I'm also realistic about the strategic utility of nationalism as a kind of rallying banner, right? So I've always wanted to think about the connections between Puerto Rico and other places, and through those connections, hopefully build solidarity, because I'm also very interested in social movements and just kind of the mechanics of social movements and organizing, and what a critical mass is, and how do you get to a critical mass, and it's like like that old school late 90s graffiti of organize with like the school of fish following the shark, And when I looked at that graffiti, I think of archipelagos. Islands are so small that we're easy prey for a shark. El tiburón de Rubén Blades, ¿verdad? But when there's a school of fish, it's different. So how can we take all these concentrated sites of U.S. imperialism or colonialism across the vastness of U.S. empire and interrelate them? And then I think of relationality, but I don't see relationality as something that's there. I think relationality is something that always needs to be articulated both intellectually and in terms of organizing, right? So in many ways, the way we write a history aids in doing the intellectual part of that, right? We want to do it so that people don't succumb to these kind of divisionist patterns, I'm also very interested in antillanismo, which is why I wrote about 19th century antillanismos. And, I grew up around a lot of Dominicans. I'm from Rio Piedras in Puerto Rico. And I remember there used to be a graffiti in Rio Piedras. I don't know if any of you remember it. Era cerca del Boricua. Y decía, mata un dominicano. And that thing was there for like a whole year. Like imagine if somebody did that right now in New York, And people would just walk by it like. And this is like the place where there's a lot of Dominicans that live in San Juan, right? So I despise that kind of hyper-nationalism, and I wish we could all find a way to dream of more sustainable and freer futures together and see each other as kin. But I'm also not naive to think that there's some kind of magical woo-woo cosmopolitanism that we're all going to arrive at and that's going to happen. It's just very repetitive, day-to-day work, both in terms of activating certain memories, articulating certain pasts, or just cultural production in general and also organizing.
Thank you. So, actually, I want to touch upon a little bit of this idea about relationality. So folks who haven't seen the exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery, I think it's called 1898 Visions and Revisions. It's worth checking out. It's a great place to start a conversation. And I think or at least how it's designed, I believe the final, part of the exhibition is this photograph, and it's a photograph that takes maybe shortly after the signing of the Treaty of Paris. And here you have 3 Filipino representatives of the Philippines still thinking that they would get U.S. recognition for being a Philippine republic. That failed. But you also have your Puerto Rican elite, Julio Gena, Manuel Seno Gandia, and Ostos. I haven't been able to identify who the Cubans were, David, so maybe you might be able to. And so I think, one of the regrets is that, while Spain and the US are having their little conversation in Paris about what's going to happen to these islands, you have these men assumably having conversations. I'm sure they weren't just there taking selfies, but like, what was that conversation? And I think, Kristen, you bring a little bit about that up. It's like, what do we do when history doesn't record some of these conversations? Oh, sorry. Hey. That doesn't record some of these conversations. And also, what about those other histories? And so, so I think let's try to rephrase that as a question then. Like, how do we write a history for which there is no archive? How do we account for that? I guess I'm a literary scholar, so yeah, that's literature. Yeah. But then, also it's to rethink these histories not just through Jose Marti, which I'm really glad you brought up, because the institutions love these names. The institutions love these events. 1898, yeah. I mean, let's just be real. That's the only way we're going to get funding to bring like these amazing people to these places to talk about the things that we want to talk about. So that said, another kind of open-ended question about how do we write these histories, or how do we account for them? Yeah, please do.
All right, so very specifically on my chapter that I presented today, I don't have any go-to document to show that Mabini is having actual political conversations with the Chamorro elite, right? If I did, I like this chapter would be a very different chapter, because I would be like, oh look, it's easy to see this kind of stuff. What I do have is Mabini's diaries, where he's like just charting, here's what's happened today. And this ends up being published together with the Philippine Revolution book that he ends up writing that on Guam itself. So, I mean, I don't have those fantastic documents, but I can also read between the lines of like what Mbini's writing about, and also try to get a sense of what the layout on Guam is in that time period, where like no one knew what was going on. So in Guam, unlike what was happening in the Philippines, where there was a U.S. military and a Spanish military presence throughout, in Guam, after the American flag was rose in 1898, there was no one on island for like a few months. So the Spanish colonial governor was like deported with the U.S. The Chamorro elite were there going, okay, what's going on? We're going to try to organize for ourselves. Then there's this U.S. military naval guy who comes in, Louis Kaiser, and goes, oh, I'm in charge, but he didn't actually have official papers to show that. So it was really influx, and people didn't know what was going on. But Jose Palomo and the Chamorro elite were trying to do the thing of like, we're going to organize ourselves, and whoever ends up coming in, we're going to like do something so that we show that we want to have some sort of political representation of some sort when they came in. So if I use that sort of idea and see them interacting in a very intimate social sphere, we can imagine that they're having these conversations, and so that's what I just sort of, hinge my arguments on. And even if I don't have those complete details, I think we can, still, say something about it. But another thing that I also want to think about is how the Chamorros here are not acting like there wasn't a life before 1898, which I think there a lot of the Guam historiography about the U.S. empire tends to do. 1898 happens, and then whatever happens before that doesn't actually really matter. And so everything post 1898, that's what we should be really looking at. And so I'm trying to go outside my comfort zone just a little bit to see how they might be bringing all of that influence and that experience from the Spanish Empire into their own political philosophy, and also melding that with indigenous Chamorro notions of inafamalik, which is this idea of like reciprocal relations and obligations, and how that can be used as forms of diplomacy. So me talking about Chamorros bringing fish and vegetables from the ranches is not just, hey, you guys are starving, let's feed you. It's like, hey, we're bringing gifts, let's have a conversation, maybe. Like, so I'm doing a little bit of that speculative work as well. Yeah, I think I'll just end with that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess part of me is very excited. I hope Nefertiti was able to hear your talk, because I think of her new book sort of offering space to think about these. I mean, remaindered life is what she talks about, but in the context of incarceration and imperialism, that detail from your talk about the diary, sort of just narrating life, daily life, in the prison, like, under captivity. I think that's the starting point of a way to tell a story that's not just overdetermined, in which 1890, like anything that happens before 1898 is just like a waiting room for the real events, or that those interpersonal relationships are continuing even under the weight of these, and maybe outside of them too.
I forgot to mention this, right? So now I said there was like those 3 men who stayed and ended up building families, right? I went to their descendants and I was like, oh, what do you remember of, Leon Flores? What do you remember of Pancracio Palting? And the grandchildren be like, oh, I remember them being staunchly Filipino, but they can speak Chamorro, right? And they are like folks who understood themselves as, yeah, inter-imperial actors in some ways, and so it's not just the archive that limitation. I was actually able to do oral histories and like talk to folks. So yeah.
That's great. I'll just say briefly, with very specific respect to the contents of my talk, right? For me, the interesting slippage is between that passport ledger that's supposedly comprehensive and complete and inclusive, and what you see on that pass of Teodoro, the enslaved man from the Congo, simply written on the back. I feel like it's the histories of the people written on the back of these pieces of paper is exactly what I'm thinking of when you ask that question. What's effaced by that colonial ledger? Like, what names aren't a part of it? And I would say, so in terms of holding that accountable, or the stories we tell, there's a very urgent and institutional one of holding institutions accountable and offering a critique when Spanish citizenship, a passport, is offered on these criteria that are fucked up, right? Like, denied paternity leaves a lot of people out of a record that could qualify them for a Spanish citizenship. Racial status leaves a lot of people out of that paper trail. And I think one of the revisions from the 2007 historical memory law and the 2022 one is that, after a lot of complaining about what gets left out, what histories are left out, the 2022 law does offer a provision of children of Spanish women who lost their nationality upon marrying a foreign man. So there is some in the really concrete terms, there's some recognition of the name of the person on the back of the passport.
I was really struck by that part of your talk, David, and I was thinking of the afterlives of like the Spanish colonial caste system and how in the early 21st century you can reap benefits from proving your proximity to peninsulares, in post-communist Cuba, which is bizarre how that one lived after, If anything, the Afro-Cubans should get some kind of reparations. Like they don't get a $200 pension because their ancestors were enslaved by Spaniards, and therefore they can't prove. So anyway, I'm very fascinated by this question and how we think of, to return to your point about how we sometimes look past what was there before 1898, as if 1898 was just like this singular turning point that just turned everything, right? To give you an example, my mother's godfather, he used to be a nationalist, and I interviewed him when before he died, and he was a very good man. He was arrested. He used to teach history actually at UPR, and he was arrested in the classroom in the 1930s. He told me, Don Pedro always said, siempre nos decía que no le podemos reprochar nada a los españoles. We have nothing to reproach from Spaniards because they gave us three things: la lengua castellana, la religión católico-romana, la religión católica, y la filosofía greco-romana, right? Those three things. And you know, in that 1930s to 1950s Spanish imaginary, right, the way that memory was constructed was everything went to shit after 1898, right? Let's not look, and that's a strategic thing too, because Don Pedro was also trying to create a coalition, right, among some of the hacendados that were maybe some of the cédula de gracias hacendados that were sidelined when big corporate U.S. agro interests came. If you look before 1898, for example, at the leadership that you mentioned, and this is a New York story because a lot of that leadership was here, there was so much drama. You know, if you read between the lines of their letters, all the way from the 1860s to the 1890s, there was so much drama, right? They were united by their common enemy, which was Spanish illiberalism, right? But there were so many different political positions, and there was an effort to put those differences aside. A lot of people felt betrayed by the Puerto Rico section because of their annexationist leanings. There was drama between, you know, elite white criollos and working class, predominantly black and mulatto organizers. And yeah, that goes all the way. I found traces of that drama going back to like when Betances first arrived in New York in the late 1860s. And he was here for a year, and he was like, he pieced out, and no podía, you know, because he was much more radical than the Cuban leadership, who were all basically Narciso Lopez's lieutenants from his failed 1840s filibusterist expedition, when he tried to get the Southern plantocracy to sponsor annexing Cuba to the U.S. to expand slavery. You know, the people who ran the separatist leadership in New York until Jose Marti came along, basically, were the remnants of that. One of them became a Confederate general. So these were the people that were trying to ally. And I'm all for reading between lines and making as much as I know Ileana has written about this, you know, of writing about silences. It's something that we really need to get on the same page about, because that old school positivist allergy, you know, to making sense of silences, or even just little traces, connotations, phrasings, insinuations in letters and documents. You have to articulate what you see there and try to make sense of it and try to connect the dots between the patterns, because those stories need to be told. Otherwise, it's a completely lopsided historiography that does very limited things.
Sorry, we're just running short on time, so I did want to open, you know, the conversation up to the folks of the auditorium as well as the folks on Zoom.
Hi, thank you so much for this for these presentations. I'm associate professor in history here at NYU. I'm French, as you can hear, but I'm also Martinican. So I'm going to ask you, or maybe tell you a little bit about that case, because I was really interested in what you were saying regarding the importance of 1898 and the challenges to this importance of 1898. And I was thinking that the scholarship and all of the discussions about places like Martinique and Guadeloupe and French Guiana and the Réunion Islands were for a long time very focused on some dates: 1848, abolition of slavery, and 1946, departmentalization. And that had a number of consequences, including kind of excluding these territories from a very vivid scholarship on colonization and decolonization in France, because the trajectory of this territory has been to not become formally decolonized, but to be more incorporated into the mainland, which is something that a number of scholars have been fighting over the years, and that's now is now like being not solved, but at least there's this insistence on what's, comparing the collective trajectories of these territories to other colonies, including after decolonization actually happened. So I'm sorry, I'm starting the whole, it's more of a comment than a question thing, but I just was very interesting in what you were saying regarding the importance of strong historization of long-term political and social trajectories of these territories, because and about the relations that you can connect, because I think that the evolution of the French scholarship and the scholarship on the French colonial empire is, and by the way, I do comparison between French Caribbeans and Puerto Ricans, and that's why I'm interested in that. And I think that comparing these places, and Tianismo should clearly incorporate Martinique and Guadeloupe, and including, last week there was like this investigation showing that Martinique is now the oldest territory in France. I mean, there's a catastrophic demographic situation. There are a number of issues that are very connected to what you could find in Puerto Rico. So I think that looking at the scholarship in these places and its evolution is also something that could add to the thinking of U.S. empire, but all of these territories.
Thank you. You raised something very tantalizing about Narcisco Lopez. Could you go further into that? Because that's the first I ever heard that. I'm very familiar with the filibuster movement, but the extension of that into the period after the Civil War, I wondered if you could flesh that out a little more.
Very briefly. It's actually a contested topic because there's a Cuban historian, I think this was in the 1970s, who wrote a very detailed biography of Narciso Lopez. And he said that he found evidence suggesting that the Lopez expedition wasn't truly annexationist, that they were pro-sovereignty, although the question of slavery is separate because most of those criollos were not willing to even entertain abolition in the 1840s, but that when he would go to, for example, he was in New York, which is where the Cuban flag was created, by his people, and then he went to New Orleans. When he was in New Orleans, he was meeting with Southern politicians there, trying to get support for his expedition, and that he would talk about annexationist aspirations with them to curry favor with them, but that he was actually taking them for a ride, right? So there's I don't think that debate has been resolved, whether his true intentions were annexationist or whether he was just saying that to get money and weapons. And they were even trying to get military experts from the U.S. So does that satisfy your?
Well, that's all known. That's known. I know that.
Okay.
What about afterwards? You're talking about the nationalist
I'm
issue.
sorry. The only thing, without going down that rabbit hole, the organizers of the separatist community in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s were lieutenants that survived his failed expeditions. So one of them was Jose Manuel Macias. Another one was Villaverde, who who's a well-known author of La Cuarterona, which was this abolitionist novel that went through many different changes and edits over the years. They themselves became separatists in their older years, and they became also like pro-independence separatists and also abolitionists. But there were some pretty heavy tensions in the 1860s. For example, when Betances came from Puerto Rico, Betances was a pretty lefty abolitionist for a property, person, and he did not see eye to eye with that leadership on the issue of slavery and many others. Yeah.
I want to ask a question, I think, about here. Let me get away from the feedback. I want to ask a question about space, right? So, and the sort of spatialization of the history of 1898 and the way we think about 1898. So, one of the things I really like about the symposium, the way they organized it, is that there's a deep commitment to colonial and post-colonial subjects themselves. Right? Like we're able to tell stories about, the Philippines and Guam. We're able to tell stories about Cuban migration. We're able to tell these like sort of infra-political, right, infraspatial histories of empire that I think at its worst, and I appreciate Professor Sartorius for complaining about US political history, right, at its worst becomes something called the Greater United States, right? And this is direct shade to a particular historiographical trend, right, that I as a post-colonial subject find completely disrespectful, right? And so I want to ask, what is it, on one hand, let's ride the tension of what it means to tell a history of a particular date, a particular time, but I just want to hear like, how does 1898, how does the world look like? How do solidarities look like? How do shared struggles look like from your particular vantage points? Because on one hand, we're able to tell these stories because of shared sufferance, right? Of the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, of the interruptions of various movements for sovereignty and nationalism, however flawed they were in the late 19th century. But on the other hand, there's something else that could be done by having these kinds of conversations that don't have to reify the American nation state in the way that you were talking about the Smithsonian Museum, right? Like I think my ambivalence of teaching 1898 in the way that it's taught is that it becomes easily subsumed as a cultural resource by the American nationalist imaginary in the same way that minoritization of colonial, post-colonial migrant subjects does, right? So, yeah.
This is just briefly. There's so much to say about that. Thank you. Just very briefly, the way I teach 1898 in many of my classes is as a Gulf story. Like when I'm teaching Caribbean history, I like to think of it as a Gulf story. And I never like it when I say something in class and students on their laptops immediately start Googling and looking things up. But it makes me want right now to look at whether in Mexico there were any like 50th anniversary reflections on 1848 in 1898, given that like Mexico is actors in 1898 are circulating in Mexico, right? Florida has an interesting history in all of this, like the kind of nodes of contact in the Gulf area. So I was there, but it was really Spaniard. It was about celebrating Spaniard. That's right. And land acknowledgement of like where we are right now.
I like going to those conferences that you're talking about only because like it's an opportunity to put a wrench in their logic of thinking, right? Because if no one else is going to go in and just go, wait a minute, listen to a person who's actually from the empire, then they're going to continue with this notion of like empire as a state building project that shows American power in an uncomplex way. And so I still think it's worthwhile to do that, especially when these folks are the ones who end up being the ones creating foreign policy or influencing international policy, or going about teaching students who will end up doing that kind of work. And so I still think it's worthwhile. I also use 1898 in my classes. I teach at Wesleyan, which is predominantly white student body, and they first of all don't know that the U.S. has an empire, right? And when they do figure it out, I want it to be less about them having guilt about that and more about saying, hey, let's actually look at the people and what's going on in more complex ways. And so it's a good way to start them off, but then you also have an opportunity to make it in the narrative that we want them to have and take away from it.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful panel. I have a very, very broad question. So if it's too broad, then work with me. I'm curious, because I'm a philosopher, I'm curious about how you think about the distinction between the categories of imperialism and colonialism as anchored in your research. Or how does your particular research kind of disrupt those two definitions and how they interact?
I have the same constant questioning. The way I simplify it to my students, but I'm not satisfied with it, I try to get them to think of the spectrum of imperialisms, right? And on one end of the spectrum, there's like the most settler colonial version of it. So there's two ends, the intensely colonial and the non-colonial. And it kind of goes case by case because each case is different. But I'm not satisfied with it because I see a lot of overlap between when we think of extraction, right? When you think of presence and extraction, which is sort of what that framework is telling us to pay attention to, that's a feature of mature global capitalism. So I've had that situation in graduate seminars where the graduate students are like, well, wait, what's the difference between imperialism and capitalism? And then that takes you into this very, detailed conversation. You have to go through the debates within political economy about that, but it's tricky. It's very tricky.
Yeah, I don't know either. But what I will say is that I always like to think of studying empire in the 19th century. Really, it is a floating signifier to think that Mexico after independence is an empire, Haiti has an emperor, that there can be, Brazil becomes an empire after 1822. There are ways that there can be anti-colonial formations that still identify as an imperial form. And that form can take all kinds of, you can pour all kinds of things into that container. So for me, the idea that, I wrote a book about sort of pro-Spanish loyalty, and what ordinary Cubans are packing into the idea of empire looks a whole lot sometimes like what the independence movement is agitating for. And in fact, sort of the idea of a racelessness in Cuba and getting rid of racial designations in official documents, that's something that Afro-Cuban activists in the 1890s are doing. They're lobbying the Spanish government. And this is now getting off topic, but I will say, like, one of the things that tipped me off to this new project was that the Directorio Central of the Sociedades de Color in Cuba press for ending racial labels in colonial documents with the exception of passports. And they still want a racial designation on a passport. And I figured that can be about suspicion of stolen documents. This is in a pre-photograph era. But the idea that rights and citizenship need to be affiliated just with nationalism, or I think I'm avoiding the colonial term, but empire really interests me as what can be packed into that if in this specific Latin American history. That's like a sliver of an answer.
So confidently gave me the mic. So thank you for asking the question. I'm writing the introduction to my book also, and I'm having to figure out all of the things that I'm trying to do about empire and colonialism and settler colonialism. And so just in the past week, I sort of broke it down for myself to see how I'm using these. And this is drawn heavily from Moon-Ho Jung's really good introduction to his book, Menace to Empire. Because he breaks it down in somewhat this way. So first of all, I see empire and not imperialism. I think I use empire just because it gives me a little bit more concreteness in a very positive sense. But as a political entity, so the fact that the United States has U.S. territories that are colonies, that are not states, and that have secondary status, and the people living within them don't have certain rights, right? So in a very political entity, formal sense, I think about empire that way. But I also think of it as a methodology in the way Moonho Jung is thinking about it, where instead of thinking thinking about empire helps us to see how it is constructed, but also how there is always already a group of people who are resisting that empire. So by acknowledging the empire, we can also see that there are groups of people who have their own histories, and we can write those kind of histories. And then the verb aspect to it, thinking about how empire does colonialism. So I see colonialism as a verb, and that is, you know, of all different kinds. So from military colonialism in the Guam context to settler colonialism to settler militarism, like I still see all of those forms as forms of colonialism, but also empire, and also how that verb of empire is also mixed in with ideologies like race, class, gender, and all the intersectionality of that. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, like grappling with empire is a way to think about asymmetries of power and how that is manifested historically, at least for me. And it's all nested and layered, right? So we can't, like, going back to what Jose was saying, we can't like parse it all out and categorize them. Things can happen at the same time, or are viewed with each other, or mixed in. And so imperialism and colonialism happens at the same time, in Guam at the very least, in the way I see it.
We're almost out of time. I'm going to collect 2 questions from the audience. And then we also have a question from Zoom. So I'm going to start with that one and then pass it to Luis and then Jose. So from Zoom, somebody says, the Spanish regard 1898 as the catastrophe, since it meant the loss of empire and influence. There is what was known then as the Generación de 1898. Is this relevant to bring this into your present discussion, or is that reserved for the Spanish to do? And then I'm going to pass it to Luis.
Yeah, in terms of overlooked histories, I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on the impact of 1898 on Islam in the Philippines, because basically the whole emphasis has been on how Spain brings Catholicism, but nothing in terms of how it affects, say, Mindanao, you know, and the presence of Islam, which was there, I think, as early as the 15th century, the 14th century, actually, with the first mosque in an island very close to the border of Indonesia today.
Hi, thank you all for this. I'm Jose Laguarta, I'm Matthew's colleague at Centro. And my question is mainly a response to Jose's presentation, but everyone else can feel free to jump in. The question is intentionally provocative, so it's going to need a little bit of preamble. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Jose, you began your presentation with a critique, right, of this kind of teleological and stagist thinking, which you said was too neat, and that point is well taken. But then you're sort of linking the Cédula de Gracias from 1815 to the recent laws 20 and 22 in Puerto Rico. To me, also felt a little too neat and got me thinking about how decolonial and relational thinking, or more so theorizing, to me often feels too neat, right? And then that also makes me wonder, and here's the provocative part, right? Whether it's a problem of these clashing epistemologies at all, which to me also kind of feels like the Huntingtonian clash of civilizations, or whether there's a problem of different reductionisms sometimes, right? And what it would mean to avoid those reductionisms by bringing different conceptions of history, right? That might feel or might arguably even be teleological at times, but that tell a part of the picture and bringing them together. And so, what would that look like? Going back to your comparison of the Cédula de Gracias and Law 2022. Going back to your last point about how relationality also always needs to be constructed, not just intellectually, but in terms of organizing, right? What are the different implications for all of the people involved in those two historical moments? And I ask this very pointedly, very specifically, because to me, the kind of Bad Bunny critique of laws 20 and 22 has certain limitations politically in Puerto Rico, and how thinking about bringing back the element of accumulation, right, as part of the logic of the colonial elites who passed those laws, and how that might be different from what they were doing in 1815, how that might give us other avenues of thinking about the present political moment in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
Josian, when you say the Bad Bunny, tú dices que se vayan, como que. Okay, okay. No, I take your point. I actually agree with your point. My preference when it comes to doing the work of writing history is to write it as, my guide is, conjunctural historiography, like in the cultural studies. So that's deep contextualization. And I do agree that there's some legitimate questions about how we all, not we all, but those of us who delve into, longue durée, right, do that, right? Sometimes it's too facile, it's too neat, right? There's always rupture, there's always change. And that would be kind of the nitpicky historian would say, well, there's always rupture, there's always change, right? But at the same time, there's also, you could counter that by saying, clearly there's resemblances between the social structure of back then and the social structure of now. So what carries over, if anything, right? And I think that needs to be deeply contextualized in every case. And I do agree also with the point about que se vayan los de afuera, because, I mean, my point with that is that que se vayan los de afuera, who's los de adentro, los de afuera? Because we've been doing this to each other for a really long time, que se vayan los de afuera so that Logan Paul doesn't get to own, his beachfront property, so that some Fonalleda can own it. So
I guess I would just say briefly to the question of Spain's role in all of this. I guess some desastres matter than others, and these laws of historical reconciliation are about the Spanish Civil War and about Franco. They're not about reparations for being a colonial subject. Interestingly, in 2015, both Spain and Portugal extended a law not for Moriscos, but for Sephardic. If you can prove Sephardic ancestry in Iberia, you can qualify for citizenship. And I have so many things to ask you about the idea of unledgered debts. And I think this is somewhere the kind of nimbus around this, like what happens when the ledger is deliberately destroyed or kind of shoved under the desk.
I mean,
No pressure.
I feel like for Luis's question about like 1898 and Islam, I think it's really interesting. I mean, this is where me as the bias of a U.S. historian comes through, because I think when we think about settler colonialism in the American context, and then how settler colonialism ends up being another form that the U.S. Army ends up taking in the Philippines to then go down through Mindanao and try to settle with more Christianized populations. I think that's probably where that change happens. But I don't also know what's happening in Spanish Empire and Mindanao too, which is probably a little bit different, perhaps.
Thank you so much. So I think we're going to wrap it up for now. But if we can just give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much.